Brody, I just hit record.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the meeting of the Sangamon Valley Democratic Club and Contra Costa Move On. My name is Brody Hill. I serve as president of the Sangamon Valley Democratic Club. Sheila Fish, the coordinator of Contra Costa Move On, and I are so glad that you were able to join us. Tonight, we have a great speaker who's going to tell us about how to rein in big tech to reclaim the promise of the internet. But first, we have some club news. We have a tradition of honoring our Volunteer of the Year with an award. And since we didn't have this tradition during the pandemic of 2020, tonight we are presenting our Volunteer of the Year award for 2019 and 2020 to a dedicated club member who serves as vice president and who has coordinated our club outreach, especially at the Danville Farmers Market for more than 2 years. Richard Adler, we appreciate you. And for those who don't know, Richard Adler is, even though he's helped us tremendously with our outreach, he is also an accomplished artist, and he has designed our new club logo. And this is the first award with a new club logo on it. Richard, thank you so much for your dedication and your
thank you. Thank you, Brody. That's unexpected. I didn't. I had to put myself back on video. I was going to be incognito there for a second, but now I can't.
Yeah. So thank you so much, and I'll deliver to your home tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's great working with you, and I hope we have many more opportunities ahead.
Thank you. It's better when it's in person, but you know, we're on Zoom. And okay, now we're going to start our meeting. If you have any questions for the speaker, you're going to put them in chat, okay? Now for our speaker, that prolific writer, Stephen Hill, whose op-eds can be found in countless number of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Politico, Guardian, and many more. Stephen is a former policy director at the Center for Humane Technology, a co-founder of Fair Vote, and journalist in residence at the Berlin Social Science Center. He has written 7 books. They've got great titles, including Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Runaway Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. 2, The Startup Illusion: How the Internet Economy Threatens Our Welfare. 3, 10 Steps to Repair American Democracy. Whoops. I'm afraid I've lost my page. Oh, there we go. And the last one, Europe's Promise: Why the European Way is the Best Hope in an Insecure Way. And you know, when you think about the internet as this global gathering place of unlimited free speech, which leads to increased democratic participation, you know, that's how we envision the internet. But that beautiful dream of an open and free internet crashed and burned one more time on January 6th, when a mob attacked the US Capitol. Did you know that for months the attack was incited and planned over Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other digital media platforms? And interestingly, today, the House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce questioned the CEOs of Facebook, Google, and Twitter. And like the committee, we ask ourselves, how did we arrive here? And what do we do now? What regulations should the Biden administration pursue? Thank you, Stephen Hill, for being here tonight to talk to us about this opportune topic: how to rein in big tech to reclaim the promise of the internet.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Brody, for that kind introduction, and hello to everyone. It's great to see people on It's beautiful. I'm in the east on the near the beach, and it's a nice day. So people are that you're indoors for a topic like this is speaks to your commitment to politics and democracy, and I salute that. So it's my pleasure to join you. So yeah, there was a hearing today. It was, as always, both interesting and disappointing. And for anybody, if you might have caught any of it, and we can talk about that if you want. And there was much discussion of things like Section 230 and some of these terms of art that we can go into if that's of interest. But what I wanted to sort of anchor this discussion in is some of us, remember way back when these companies first made appearance. I mean, they sort of, I sometimes liken it to, you might have heard about the story of a Mexican cornfield. A farmer walked out one day and saw this little bump in the middle of his cornfield. He's like, huh, what's that? I have no idea what that could be, where that came from. Is that from an animal, a groundhog or something making problems? Next day he comes out, the bump is twice as big. And next day it was 4 times as big, and it just kept growing. And it was the start of a volcano in the middle of his cornfield that eventually took over his cornfield, his house, his entire property, and the entire town. Now, if you look at photos of that online, you can just see like the church steeple sticking up from all the lava beds and things that basically inundated this town. And so we forget that these companies started out small. They were startups at one time, as they're called. And they seemed really cool, the way that Facebook could help us connect to old college friends and roommates and and post our puppy pics and our vacation pics. And it just seemed like infinitely great, even liberatory in a sense, in the way that it connected us. The way we could search the internet using Google search engines, and the way we could go online on Amazon and initially buy books so easily. It was so convenient. They expanded into other products. We thought, okay, that seems pretty cool. It's so convenient. I can just order it. It shows up on my door. And so these companies started out with a great deal of popularity, a great deal of enthusiasm. Silicon Valley was leading the way. It was, showing how the future will be. I spent a lot of time in Europe writing about politics and going to conferences and such things. They were completely envious of us. Like, why can't Germany create the new Facebook and Google and Amazon? Why do these things start in the US? What about Europe is deficient in some ways? So that's where we were back in 2005, 2010. And then, we noticed some problems starting to emerge, and Facebook with abusing data. And so then the Department of Justice put some rules around them, and they said, okay, we're so sorry, we'll never do that again. And then it happened again. Oh, we're so sorry, it won't happen again. And so more and more problems began to emerge. And what we saw was that in essence, 4 different types of what is called a platform. These companies are called platforms, which is really just a fancy term for a company that delivers a certain product or service. I mean, in some ways, AT&T is a telephone platform, but this is the term of art that's become used for these digital companies. So there's 4 types of platforms that have emerged. One are digital media platforms. I don't use the term social media. For one, there's really not much social about it anymore compared to what it's become. And secondly, it's just become what we think of as Facebook is so many different businesses now besides just us reconnecting to our college roommates and posting our vacation pics. There's also the publishing part of it. There's a marketplace on there now. There's all sorts of different parts of it. So it's not really social media anymore. Also, another type of platform was search, Google, Yahoo, GPS. Third one was commercial platforms like Amazon and Apple, even some of the music platforms that are selling music. And then fourth, doesn't get nearly talked as much, labor platforms. Well, like Uber. Uber does get a lot of talk, but there's a lot of other ones out there too, like Upwork, where you can go online and you can purchase, you can buy the services of a web developer who lives in Thailand, You can buy the services of an architect who lives in Great Britain. And so there's a huge amounts of commerce going on all these 4 different types of platforms, and all of them are unique, but they also all share some rather new qualities compared to previous companies. And these new qualities are in some ways the crux of the dilemma that we have to figure out. One is they have what's called unlimited reach or scale. So suddenly having a global audience or a global platform is done without any problem at all. And that was never really possible before. You know, I mean, if you talk about labor markets, for example, sure, you could outsource your factory to India, but the cost of doing that was huge. And so it was prohibitive, and it kept many businesses here. Now you can go on Upwork or some of these other labor market platforms, and you can purchase somebody's labor without any problem at all. And so you can go on those platforms, and you can see on those same platforms Americans bidding for those jobs, and they're wanting $60, $70 an hour. And you can see someone from Cambodia who will take $2 an hour for that same job. And so suddenly workers all over the world are pitted against each other in trying to make a decent living. And of course, for the buyer, it's a great deal. You can play the workers off against each other, no problem. But it does create a lot of issues that we have to think through. So these companies grew enormously large on a global scale. And with the unlimited scale, another quality was what's called near zero friction. You can do it with ease. You can send a message around the world to can be picked up by millions of people through Facebook or through Twitter or what some of these others. And it's just, you just put it out there, and it can be passed along. It can be liked, followed, sent along its merry way around the world. That's called friction. If you think about before, when we used to make phone calls, if you wanted to call someone around the world, how hard it was, especially if you wanted to reach tons of people. The telephone service comes with a lot of friction compared to these new platforms and these new technologies. The third thing is non-human curation. Before, there was, depending on the technology, there was always some human involved in some way in the transmission of the product or service. And now, especially when it comes to transmission of information and news and these sorts of things, it's being done by algorithms. And the algorithms are programmed by humans, but even those who create the algorithms say we can't always predict what the outcome will be, if it will do what we think. The algorithms do surprising things. There was a rather infamous story of Microsoft created a bot and put it on Twitter, and the bot was just going to kind of bounce around Twitter and converse with people and sort of announced that it was doing this, and more people began just purposely saying horrible, racist, sexist things to it, and then the bot began picking up on these things, until then the bot started spitting out these same things. And by the time they got through the experiment, the bot had become this horrible, racist, sexist presence on Twitter, praising Nazis, praising Adolf Hitler, and all these sorts of things. So these algorithms are really quite clever. It's pretty amazing technology, but we don't always know what we're getting. And the non-human curation, the lack of humans involved in the information chain now is something that more and more people are saying, well, look, I mean, Fox News and New York Times and all these other media platforms, they weren't perfect. They had their problems too, but at least there was a human there where you could say you're accountable if you say something really horrible, or you put out information that's really disinformation. Now these platforms put out this kind of disinformation with near zero friction, unlimited reach, and this is what at the crux of what a lot of the problems are. So this is the business model they've created. So then the fourth part of this business model is what they call hyper-targeted engagement for profit. So now, under the pressure to turn a profit, they began a business model that has now become known as surveillance capitalism. And some of you may have heard this term before. It was surveillance capitalism was a business model that was started by Google, and now pretty much all digital businesses, digital-based businesses, are picking up on one version or the other of it. And basically, what that means is they vacuum up huge amounts of personal data from users. So on Facebook, every time you hit the like or share, or on Twitter, when you try to share something, or if you try to follow, or any of the buttons that are on all these platforms, they are accumulating that data. And in fact, I've interviewed the person from Facebook who invented the like button. I mean, it's hard. You don't ever stop and think for a second and that, wow, someone actually invented that thing. And he said, when we invented it, we just thought this would be really cool. Like, everybody will be able to show what they like, and we'll all be able to see what each other likes, and it's just going to be a very cool thing. And initially it was, but eventually, as Facebook figured out how to really monetize that by using all that data, they created what's called psychographic profiles about all of us. So they have all this data on us, not only what we like and share and all these sorts of things, but also they're tracking us. They're geographically tracking you everywhere you go. I mean, all those apps have the, unless you've actually turned it off, and even when you turn it off, I've discovered, depending on what you do with that app at some point, it automatically turns its tracking abilities back on, and you don't even know it. And so they are tracking when you go to church, they're tracking what grocery stores you go to, they're tracking, where you go to work. They are tracking everywhere you go. And as there was a wonderful series on the New York Times where they showed that just by having all the data of tracking where you go, they can actually identify you as an individual. And so they have all this data on us now that they're using to track us, they're using to create these profiles of us. So what do they do with this? So this is what they use to monetize. This is how Facebook basically had $86 billion in revenue last year. And to give you a sense of how much money that is, that's more revenue than, basically MSNBC, CNBC, Fox News, ABC, CBS, all these companies combined. So we're talking an enormous amount of revenue from these companies that they're getting through this business model. And so what they do with the data is they are not selling that data in most cases, though some platforms do sell data, but mostly they're selling access to us, to our psychographic profiles, to advertisers, to political actors, who then can hyper-target their message to us in a way that they, are trying to reach us. And so, some people think, well, if they can, better target ads at me, what's the problem there? Well, yeah, there's a degree of truth to that. But, on the other hand, do you really need to keep seeing the ad for those red shoes that you've already bought, and keep seeing the ad for the next 3 or 4 weeks? Probably not. So, sometimes these algorithms aren't so accurate, but they also are doing other things like, for example, at one point, Facebook was telling prospective advertisers, we can tell you just from the likes and shares and the posts that are happening on our platform, we can tell you which teenagers are emotionally having a hard time. Some of them are even suicidal. And so these teens can be targeted with ads by you for things that might help them feel good. Like target them with new types of makeup, or target them with new types of clothes or other things, consumer type things that they can buy and consume in order to make up for that they're having an emotionally hard time. And so their ability to take this data and target people in all sorts of ways is unprecedented. And and previously, when people worried about this kind of spying, this kind of surveillance, it was about governments doing this to us. And there was a universal acceptance that this is not good. We had too many experiences with things like the Nazis and the Gestapo and, the Soviet Union and communism. And now we hear about China and its social rating system and how they're tracking people. And there's something about that, at least for Americans, that is extremely troubling. And yet here we have these companies that are targeting us and using the technologies in a way, not to target us necessarily for good health things, or, there's ways that if we were being targeted and it was helping us in our daily lives, they would say, okay, that's okay. Instead, they're just targeting for commercial purposes, because what their goal is to do is to keep you on the platform. Because the longer you stay on their platform, the more you see ads, and the more ads you see, the more profit they make. I mean, Facebook's business at $86 billion is pretty much all from advertising. And so, and now this also spills over into politics, where they are selling political ads, but also various political agents are using that quality on Facebook and on Twitter and other platforms to target people. And the Facebook algorithms and these platform algorithms are geared to increase what's called engagement. And so what does engagement mean? That means you see one thing and you read it or look at it, and then you click on another thing. And the platforms make recommendations to people about, okay, you liked what you just saw. Here's another one that's just like it. Click on this one. And they keep you clicking and clicking and clicking. And, hours later, I mean, I'm sure many of you have had this experience. I've had the experience, hours later, you've gone down the rabbit hole of YouTube, clicking on video after video. My weakness is watching videos of like old rock and rollers, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Neil Young, the Beatles. I mean, I'll just sit there hour after hour if I'm not careful. Well, that seems benign enough, but for other people, it's climate change videos, seeing how, about a majority of the videos on YouTube about climate change deny the science. And there's been studies showing that 70% of the videos that people watch on YouTube are from their recommendation algorithm. So YouTube is showing you one video that says, climate change is a hoax. And because you've watched that one, now they have others lined up saying, here's another video that has a similar message. And so people watch video after video, they share it with others, those others watch it, and that's where we get, this sort of increasingly difficult ability to form consensus on important social issues, because people are seeing these videos that are recommended to them that are simply being put there because of the engagement criteria of the algorithms. One study found that the likelihood that a person will watch a conspiracy video is that they already watched conspiracy videos. So when you watch one, the recommendation algorithm shows you another, and you watch that one and it shows you another. And by doing this, you not only watch these videos, but you start connecting with other people that have similar tendencies. So this is, these kind of hyper-targeted ads, hyper-targeted political messages that are geared for engagement, geared to keep you on their platforms. This is why, in the middle of an election year where you have all sorts of voter suppression going on, you have all sorts of, after the election, people saying the election was stolen, all these sorts of things. You have these platforms that are very reluctant, even though, they tend to lean liberal, I think it's fair to say, in terms of who runs them, but their politics don't matter, because they as far as they're concerned, advertising dollars from the right is as good as advertising dollars from the left. Because if they have these sensational videos, if they have Donald Trump on there, saying the election's stolen, and you have all these people clicking on that and others that are sharing it and following it and liking it, that to them is just more money. And it's just that simple. They've never denied this. They don't say, oh, well, we don't keep those things on there, even though they're expressly untrue. When I was the policy director for the Center for Humane Technology last spring, we had a project in which we were trying to get we had a lot of great contacts within the platforms, within Facebook, Twitter, and Google, because many of the people who started CHT were themselves former Silicon Valley leaders. They had worked in all these companies and they had contacts there. So we were trying to use what we knew about their abilities to reach people, to get Facebook, for example, to send out better health information about COVID and to prioritize information from the CDC and all these sorts of things. And, you know, there was just a huge amount of reluctance there to do that initially. They just said, it's not our role. We're just a neutral platform. We're the public square. We're just passing on for information. Yeah, but you're putting videos up there that are saying the coronavirus is a hoax. You have videos up there saying it was started by Bill Gates. You have videos up there, claiming that if you inject yourself with Clorox, it'll heal you. I mean, people are going to die as a result of this. And it just took an unbelievable amount of pressure, not only from organizations like ours, but then finally from public officials themselves, to put pressure on these companies before they actually started prioritizing some of the better and safer health information. But they still were really reluctant to crack down on the misinformation and the disinformation, so, if they can't do this in the middle of a global pandemic, and then finally they did do some of it. So in some ways we saw Facebook and Google and others at their best during that time, but it was still not nearly good enough. There was still, hundreds of millions of pieces of mis and disinformation being passed along these platforms. And sometimes they're being passed along, for example, in Facebook, they have Facebook groups, which are these private groups. You have to be allowed into them and these sorts of things. And so in these private groups, it's like their own little club in which Facebook has created the technology for all of them to find each other, to start sharing information that's completely untrue, convincing doubters that it is true, with personal anecdote and all sorts of things, to the point where you have in these Facebook groups what I call crazy town. It's just one after another of mis and disinformation being propagated, and then those people then go and share it out of the group into other parts of Facebook, other social media, digital media, and to friends and family. And so, in the middle of a pandemic, as a country, we couldn't even agree to wear masks. I mean, it didn't help that at the top, as you all know, we had terrible leadership. But even within that, it didn't help. I mean, you can look at other countries like Germany, where they had really good leadership leading them, but they still had Facebook, and they still had anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers passing on mis and disinformation along these platforms. So this is, it's a really big problem. It hits at a lot of values within the United States about free speech, open internet. We still, so many people still remember back to the 2000s when these companies were cool, and we really liked what they did, and we're reluctant to sort of rein them in a way that would seem like we're going to lose the values of the good things that we got from them, or we're going to somehow curtail free speech. But on the other hand, the idea that this is a public square, in which we all can just, I mean, at this point, it's pretty obvious this is not just a neutral public square anymore. I mean, Facebook at a certain point did cut off the president of the United States, as did Twitter and Google. And before that, as I said, they were deciding whether or not to amplify, their algorithms were deciding whether or not to amplify certain disinformation. And if people are liking it and sharing it and the engagement is there, the algorithm amplifies it. That's editing. I mean, it may be an algorithmic editor instead of a human editor, but that is editing. That's publishing. So at this point, we have to recognize that these platforms are not simply exclusively public squares. They are also publishers. In fact, as a publisher goes, you might have seen the headlines a few weeks ago. Facebook cut off the entire country of Australia. And back in 2014, Google cut off the entire country of Spain, because in both cases, these countries were saying to these platforms, okay, look, you are taking the content of our original news creators, so newspapers, TV broadcasters, and what have you, and you are featuring those on your website. You are repackaging that information and you are monetizing it, and you're not giving any of the money back to these news creators. And the problem that, I mean, if you think back to when Google, for example, first started, you would sort of see a headline and you would click on that and it would take you to the news source. And so when you went to that news source, then that news source that created that content to begin with, they got the advertising revenue. But increasingly over time, Facebook, Google, and others, they started not only having just the headline, but then they'd have blurbs. They'd have, 4 or 5, 6, 7 lines, and even a photo in which you could see what the headline was about. You could get the gist of it from the blurb, and from the information they were presented and from the photo. And so increasingly more and more people were not clicking on the links and going to the original news source. Instead, they were just scanning all the headlines on Facebook and on Google. And as a result, Facebook and Google were getting all the advertising dollars. And so we've reached a point now where 60% of all online advertising revenue in the world goes to 2 companies, Facebook and Google. And actually Amazon now gets 10%. So you have 70% of all the online advertising revenue in the world going to 3 companies. That leaves the other 30% for the tens of thousands of media outlets that are out there. And so this is one of the big reasons why so many media outlets are in trouble now. Media have always depended on advertising. And suddenly these new entities have come along that are taking all the advertising, and increasingly the growth of advertising in general is digital online advertising, not advertising in newspapers. The other place where like newspapers made money was in classifieds, and putting those little advertisements in the back of the newspapers. But as other online entities like Craigslist and others started doing that, it just has eaten away at the base, at the financial base of the content producers, the news and content producers of the world. And so we're literally eating our own seed, where we already see all the disinformation and crazy town information on these platforms, on Facebook and Google and what have you. But at least there's some, you can see some solid news, some good journalism, because they're linking to these other media outlets that are out there. But as these media outlets die or they lose their ability, many newspapers don't have investigative journalists anymore. They can't afford them. Many newspapers and media outlets have had to cut back. Was it Huffington Post? I think I just saw they just laid off 50 or so journalists from the Huffington Post because they can't afford it anymore. So as Facebook and Google have taken so much of the advertising dollars from these other media outlets, it is undermining the financial foundation of the free press, is basically what's going on. So, this is, it's hard to just simply say, well, Facebook is a public square and Google are just the public squares, when we see these kind of outcomes that are also occurring. They are more than one thing. They are a publisher at this point, but yet they are not beholden to any of the rules and regulations that publishers have to follow. And so this is a big problem. Now, some of the other, issues that we've seen with these platforms have to do with, their impacts and for many people who are still using it to, post your vacation pics and connect with friends, some people that's all they see. And so they're like, what's the big deal? But that's not all it's being used for. So for example, Facebook is being used by disinformation campaigns. It has been used by and disinformation campaigns in over 70 countries to undermine elections. And it's even helped elect a quasi-dictator, Duterte, in the Philippines. And the Philippines is a rather alarming story about what can happen to democracies. So you had this kind of strongman type figure who was running for president. And what they did was they used Facebook to plant the seeds of stories about other politicians and about drug running and drug trafficking in Philippines, and connecting these other politicians to drug trafficking with no evidence at all, just putting that out there and then having their own forces like it, share it, spread it. And they even created, one of the alarming things about the digital technologies, they can create what's called deep fakes. If some of you may have heard of this, with a deep fake, you can take a video, for example, and you can put the head of someone else on that video, and it will look like it is that person. You have to look really closely, and increasingly as they get more sophisticated, you have to be trained to spot what's wrong with that video, to know that it has been tampered with. And so Duterte created a deep fake of his leading critic, a female politician, one of the leading politicians in the legislature, and put her head on a woman's body having sex. And they spread this video all over the Philippines and basically said that, this is her. Look, and she's a shameless hussy. She's involved with drug traffickers. She's involved with all these sorts of things. And so they use this type of technology in very alarming ways to basically whip up a type of hysteria that led to this, people calling for, we need a strong arm president who will crack down on these drug traffickers, who will crack down on these politicians who are in bed with the drug traffickers. And he won. And he's been using this technology ever since. There's all sorts of interviews with some of the journalists who saw this happen in the Philippines, and as well as with the opposition politicians, that this was happening to the woman who this deep fake was made about. I mean, it was extremely alarming. And the Philippines is not the only place where this kind of thing has been done. In Myanmar, a Buddhist leader used Facebook, and keep in mind, in Facebook, in some of these countries, Facebook's penetration is about 90%. 90% of the population is using Facebook. And in fact, in some of these countries, Facebook has gone there and invested huge amounts of money to the point where the internet is Facebook. There's really no difference. That's how you get on the internet. That's what you use when you're on the internet. There's no difference between Facebook and the internet. So in Myanmar, a Buddhist leader used Facebook to whip up hysteria against the Rohingya Muslim minority, and it led to genocide of crowds, people attacking, saying these Rohingyas in this village here are engaged in child abuse. They're engaged in all these sorts of things. So these kind of things are happening in many, many countries. It's also been used to live stream child abuse. The New York Times had just a gripping, gut-wrenching series about how Facebook, also Zoom, this amazing technology we're on now, has been used for child abuse in real time, where there are audiences watching, shouting encouragement, and all these sorts of things. And the victims come forward and ask for Facebook or Zoom or whomever. Well, Zoom doesn't have a replica, but for Facebook, where the record lives on, and Google too, YouTube, they ask that this be taken down. They say, this is actually a video recording of my own rape. And these companies say, you know what, we're a neutral platform. We don't make judgments about things like this. And it's alarming to hear, but check out the New York Times series they did on this. It was just, extremely, extremely disturbing to read about how these technologies are being used. The mass murderer in Christchurch, New Zealand, who went after all the Muslims, he used Facebook to live stream his massacre. So these technologies are powerful. They have huge opportunities to do good. They have huge opportunities to do evil. That's the only word I can think of to call for some of the uses that they've used for this. And as I've mentioned, on YouTube, 50% of the videos on there, when you type in climate change and in related themes, they deny the science. And 70% of what people are seeing on YouTube is from the recommendation engines. They're looking for engagement. They're looking to make sure that you are, keep clicking, because when you click, you see more ads. You see more ads, they make more dollars. That's just really all it's about. So, I've just sort of outlined some of what the challenges are. I mean, I'm telling you the things that are going wrong on these platforms. Obviously, there's still a lot of good there, and that's really the challenge here: is how do we put the right rules and regulations around these platforms to keep what's clearly good about these technologies, and really mitigate much of the bad. I mean, and you all know about what happened on January 6th. So it's another, I guess we can say the number of the figure of 70 countries being used to undermine democracy was before January 6th. So we're now at 71 and counting. So what can we do to rein in these platforms? There's a number of things that are being discussed, not only here in the US, but also in the European Union and in other countries like Australia. Australia just passed a law that said that Facebook and Google and these other companies have to pay revenue, some of their advertising revenue, to the original news creators that are creating the news and the information that they are repackaging and monetizing. And that's when they passed that law, is when Facebook shut down Facebook in Australia for a few days. It was just a stunning display of platform power, showing, you want to mess with us? This is what we can do. And is that okay? Should we allow a private company that's become so crucial to how we receive and share and get information, to be able to shut off an entire country or to shut off the president of the United States? I mean, I'm sure many of you cheered when Donald Trump was shut off, understandably. But next time it could be Joe Biden. There's no guarantees here. So what a lot of people are talking about is we have to recognize that as these companies are no longer small and they scale to be these enormous companies, they are in many ways the new digital infrastructure of the world, and certainly of the United States. So, I mean, you think about it, how we get our news and information, how we purchase on Amazon, how we sometimes purchase labor on Upwork and Uber, how we navigate through GPS, how we find things on the internet through search. This is a new type of infrastructure. And we have a lot of experience in the US, and the EU does too, on how to put rules around infrastructure, because we've done it before for things like power companies and railroads and telephone companies. These are all regulated like utilities. And so one path here that many people are increasingly talking about is regulating these technologies like a investor-owned utility. Doesn't mean a government-run utility. They can still be owned by private investors and shareholders, but it's an investor-owned utility. And as a utility, they would be subject to what I call a digital operating license. So a digital I mean, if you think about, Ford Motor Company can't just come to Oakland, California, and put an assembly plant in the middle of downtown Oakland. They have to, in order to put an assembly plant up, they have to get permits and licenses, and they have to go through procedures. And most businesses, in order to operate, has to get some sort of license or permit or something that, tells them what the rules and regulations are, and make sure that they're aware of the rules and regulations. This is just common. We've been doing this for hundreds, probably thousands of years. This is very common. But when it comes to these companies, they kind of exist everywhere and nowhere. They don't really operate by any rules, but the ones that they created when they were very small, and now they're enormous, and still they're making up the rules. And so a digital operating license would basically put the rules around these companies about how you can operate, and how you can operate around things like, if you have a piece of information and you amplify that information, you don't, it's not just someone posting it, but you actually have a technology, an algorithm that's amplifying and pushing it out to more and more people. That's no longer just a passive web board. That's a machine that's amplifying and is publishing these sorts of things. So maybe we're going to put some rules around how your algorithms amplify. Maybe we're going to put some rules around, can you collect our data at all? You know, I mean, think about it. These companies didn't ask for any of our permissions back in the 2005 when they were first getting going, 2007. They didn't ask for permission to start vacuuming up all of our data. They just did it. And now we see the ramifications of some of that. So now that we know, should we allow them to do this? I mean, we, the people, can write the rules here. We don't have to take what the companies have created and just say, oh, I guess that's just how it is. We can decide, no, you are no longer allowed to take our data without asking permission first, for example. And so now with California, we do have a law, the California Consumer Protection Act, that gives us the ability to opt out. And that's a step in the right direction, but it gets the causation in reverse. We shouldn't be having to opt out. The companies should be asking us to opt in. And if we don't want to opt in, they shouldn't be able to take any of our data. This is, this is certainly an option of how these technologies should work. By making it so that they can't have our data, then maybe they have to act differently and behave as better corporate citizens in order to have our data and to win our confidence. But it starts with, if you really want to get at the heart of surveillance capitalism, you have to start with, these companies should no longer be able to just scrape our data from us in any way they see fit. So you can require them to get users' permission. You know, some people think they just shouldn't be able to get our data at all. Some have suggested, well, we could sell our data to them. Well, that'll never work, because the amount of money that you would get for your data, like, from Facebook, it would be annually like maybe $10 a year. I mean, you're not going to get any amount of money that makes it worth it to you to basically give them carte blanche to do anything they want with your data. And so the data really only has value, whether it's to Facebook or to society in aggregate, when it's all pooled into, and it can be used in different ways. I mean, this data can be used, if it was in responsible hands, to create more artificial intelligence that could help society. But I mean, the current paradigm is that these companies have all the data. They, in some cases, let university laboratories use that data to create products for them or to do some experiments, but it's always under the control of the big Silicon Valley platform companies. Well, we could create a data oversight agency where the data is a repository, is put in a repository there, and then it's that oversight agency allows an operation who wants to develop a new product or try to develop a new product to have access to the data they need to develop artificial intelligence, but it's done under very tight rules. I mean, what we have now is like the tobacco companies basically coming up with their own tests and deciding those tests are good and going forward with their product. That's basically what we have here. And so that kind of thing has to change. And so there's increasing talk about some sort of data oversight agency or some sort of oversight agency, watchdog, that would be like, these SEC, the Securities Commission was starting in the 1930s when it was created because of a big problem. So, having another federal oversight agency. In fact, in California, we just passed another law. It was kind of CCPA Part 2, in which is going to create a California oversight agency for these platform companies. So that's another thing that we can do. Should we rein in the mega size of these companies? There is a great deal of effort and emphasis right now on some sort of antitrust breakup of these companies. Certainly, we have Facebook that bought its two biggest competitors, Instagram and WhatsApp, and so in addition to Facebook's 2.6 billion users, which makes it the largest publisher in the world, but it's the largest publisher in the history of the world by far. It also owns WhatsApp and Instagram, which have another couple of billion users. So this one company basically has users that amount to like half of the world's population. And so should it be broken up? There's different arguments on different sides on this both sides of that. I think some sort of breakup makes sense in certain ways, but we have to be clear that if you were to spin off Instagram and WhatsApp from Facebook, and so now you have a couple companies with 1 billion, 2 billion users, and they're still operating by the same rules, you really haven't accomplished much. So, I think antitrust makes sense, but we have to change the rules that these companies are operating by. Another way to reduce the size of these companies would be to take away their revenue model, which is this, taking our data, using that to create psychographic profiles, and then using that to attract advertisers who target us. So it's basically an advertising-driven revenue model. But we actually could go to more of a monthly subscription model, like Netflix is, or like your cable TV is. And if you did that, I've actually interviewed the former director of monetization at Facebook. He estimates if Facebook had to go to a subscription model, it would shrink by 90%. Now, keep in mind, that would still leave Facebook with about 200 million users. It would not be a small company, but it would be much smaller than it is today. And there are a lot of other good reasons for having a subscription model for Facebook and some of these companies. And so that's another possibility that we could look at. Some of the other things that we should do, and maybe I'll just wrap up with this so we can talk about it a little bit. I'm interested in hear your thoughts and reactions. Is that we should do what we used to call at Center for Humane Technology a digital update. So there are existing laws that apply to companies on the ground and that don't apply. So, for example, around political advertising, transparency and reporting and all these sorts of things. I mean, it took us decades to pass these laws, and they were pretty imperfect as they were. And suddenly these new companies with their technologies come along and just blow a hole in them, where there's no reporting, really, very little reporting, very little transparency about who's buying ads on these platforms. So let's apply the ads the laws that already exist to these platforms, so that they at least have to follow the same rules. Same with, for example, children's television programming. It took us many years to pass laws about violence on TV and cartoons on Saturday morning and these sorts of things. And then YouTube comes along and just blows a hole in that. And so kids can get on there and they can see whatever they want. And there's violence and there's no restrictions. And they've tried to say, well, let's say you have to restrict some of this by age. Well, the companies say, well, it's very hard to verify age. Age verification is a big challenge. Well, other people I talk to in Silicon Valley say, no, that's ridiculous. I mean, they can tell by what you like and share, and they can tell by even what you do with your mouse. They can see how long you've spent on certain items that you're seeing on the web. They can totally tell within a certain amount how old people are. And so they could put these kind of rules around what you're watching on these on YouTube, what have you. And again, it's creating, remember one of my early comments, they said there's near zero friction on here. It's about creating more friction so that this type of mis and disinformation and violence and what have you can't just zoom around the internet so fast. And by putting more friction on, especially when it's applied to children, that would be a good thing. I think the other thing that another frame that I like to talk about it, when I think about these companies and their products and their technologies, I think of them more now, not as a public square, but as a machine. They basically have created a machine that has certain components. For example, when they do the design, like the buttons, they've tested the buttons. They use red buttons more often than blue buttons because red attracts the eye more. I used to work with a guy who created what's called infinite scroll. When you're on your mobile phone and you could just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and seeing more and more and more and more and more. That's called infinite scroll. That was designed to keep you on the platform so that you never leave and you see more ads. They also have, other features where, you see a YouTube video and it automatically shows you the next one. And that's to keep you watching, to keep you on there. So these are all what they call dark patterns. These are methods that are used, purposely used, designed into these. They know exactly what they're doing. I mean, you have engineers that have, using the latest in psychological knowledge to basically keep people on these platforms and keep watching ads and keep watching all the content on there because they don't want you to leave. And so we can put restrictions around the use of dark patterns. We don't have to accept the design of these products as they are. And we can have liability around it. It's almost like, for example, coming up with a vaccine. I mean, you wouldn't allow a company to come up with a vaccine and just start injecting it into people and say, well, let's see if it works. Let's test it out. They test it under very strict conditions. They have to test it in ways that minimizes harm, and it's done with a lot of rules and government oversight, and it has to be approved. Similarly with medical devices, they can't just create a new device, open up your chest, stick that in and say, oh, let's try it and see how it works. No, you have to test that product ahead of time. You have to show that the first use of that product is going to work the same way as the 10,000th use of that product. These are the types of product liability that many other companies and products are subject to. And, I think we're reaching the point where we have to have some sort of product liability around these machines that these companies have created. I mean, I mostly focused in my comments on digital media platforms, but there's similar things to be said for Amazon. Amazon is basically, like a shopping mall in which they actually own some of the stores in the mall, and they have all the data on what all the different stores in the mall are selling, and they see what's hot, and they can go to the maker of that product that's hot and say, we want you to give us a special deal, or we're going to hide your store from the other shoppers in the mall, and we're going to promote our own stores that are going to sell the same product that you're selling. So Amazon is doing a lot of manipulation with its data, and it's hurting a lot of small businesses. They like to promote themselves as we're helping small businesses, and to some degree they do. But on the other hand, as Amazon becomes, as shopping malls shut down and anchor stores like Macy's and others in stores shut down because everyone's shopping online, small businesses don't have much choice but to be on Amazon, and Amazon shakes them down to get the best deal for their own products and their own revenue streams, because they have access to all the data and they know what everybody's selling and what's hot and what's not. So there's many issues around these different platforms. The labor platforms, Uber and others, have obviously a lot of other issues that we don't have time to go into. But basically, we're creating a whole new business model for the 21st century, and every one of them in one way or another has major problems. And in many ways, the crux of all of them comes down to data. Who has the data, and who controls the data, and who decides what happens with that data? And that's the thing that we really have to get a handle on. If we don't, I think we're going to look back 20 years from now and we're going to say, wow, we didn't get it right. And now we really regret a lot of what's happened to society. So I'll stop there, and thanks for listening. There's a lot to talk about and a lot of issues. We touched upon a number of them.
Wow, that was really great. I like the way you put everything together. We have some questions in chat. Let me see if I can get to the top. I think the first one was, would you explain Section 230?
Oh, right, yeah.
And where we go from here about it?
So Section 230 was a law, a part of a law passed in 1996 called the Communication Decency Act. And it was basically just an afterthought in this act put in there, keep in mind when these platforms and these types of companies were small. And it basically, what they were trying to avoid was, like, you remember when everybody used to chat back and forth on these platforms, and they still do, but, when it was new, there was a concern that, like, let's say someone posted something that was racist or terrible or even illegal, child porn or whatever, that it would hold the platforms responsible for that. And if the platforms are responsible, then the platforms would start, not posting things, not allowing things to be posted. It would cut down and cut away from this dream that everyone had of the free and open internet. This was the big dream in the 1990s. And so they passed this little part. It's just a very short part of this Communication Decency Act called Section 230, which basically says that the platforms are not responsible for two things. One, if they decide that they should censor something, if they should cut something off because for whatever reason, that they can't be sued for that. And the second thing that it said was it's not responsible for, you know, any of the even crazy stuff that is posted through chat groups and on their platforms. So by doing this, they were trying to indemnify these companies against a bunch of lawsuits based on some content that might get posted that would cause, you know, that caused someone to be upset or, you know, even was potentially illegal. And at the time, it seemed like a great idea. It basically allowed these platforms to grow and to and not worry about, you know, any of the issues that might plague a traditional media outlet like the New York Times, where, you know, if you put something on there, you can be sued for libel, or and you, of course, you would never put child pornography on the New York Times. You can, you know, there would be a bunch of people that would leave and cancel their subscription. So, you know, this was the point of Section 230. So then you flash forward now from 1996, decades later, and suddenly there's, you know, people saying like, we've got to revamp Section 230. These platforms aren't responsible enough for the disinformation that's on there. And I share that view. But here's the thing, but I don't think that the proponents are really taking into account, is that much of what is on Facebook and Twitter and other platforms is protected by the First Amendment. You know, I mean, really, what the platforms are getting away with putting on there, that if you took away Section 230, they have to do more about, is what's called illegal speech. So things like child pornography, you know, any type of snuff films, or you know, any type of violence or threats, things that are threats, yelling fire at a crowded theater type of things. Those types of things, they would have to rein in if you get rid of Section 230. But that's just a drop, really a drop in the 100 billion pieces of information that are posted on Facebook like every week. So, you know, I think for those who are advocating for getting rid of Section 230, it's not going to do as much as they hope it would do. And for those who are saying, no, you don't do that, you'll completely wreck the internet, it's not going to harm as much as they say it will. Really, Section 230 is almost kind of a distraction from the real harms and the real problems that are going on these platforms. You know, the type of disinformation that is terrible that's on there, like climate change denial, that's not illegal, okay? And people are entitled to put what they want on there. But the problem is not just that somebody's is putting that on these platforms, is that the algorithms then promote that, because, you know, some people start clicking on it and like it, or they even, you know, think, oh, this is interesting, and they share it. And so the more it gets that kind of those interactions, the more the algorithms start noticing it, and they say, oh, this thing is hot, let's promote it even more. And it fuels itself, and it just keeps going. And before you know it, these sorts of kind of crazy town content has millions of viewers and readers. So Section 230, I don't see how revoking Section 230 or even tweaking Section 230 would do anything about that kind of stuff. It just would, the type of example I gave before, like that New York Times series about people putting, you know, using platforms to live stream child abuse in real time. That kind of thing could be cracked down on, and that would be good in my view. And yes, maybe we'll lose some speech along the way, but I mean, you can't allow a decent society, a democratic society, can't allow that kind of stuff to go on, in my view. So as far as I'm concerned, sure, revoke Section 230. It'll help us crack down on that kind of thing. But don't think for a second it's really going to deal with the main problems with these platforms.
Richard, do you want to take the next question? Here, I'll do it since I know where we are. Sorry. How about putting community representatives on the board of companies as they do in some EU countries? Will that work?
I think what the questioner is referring to in Europe, in Germany, and other places, they have what's called co-determination, where workers elect 50% of the members of the boards of directors of major companies, which is pretty amazing. It's the workers that elect it, though, not the community writ large. But still, it is an amazing institution. I wish more Americans knew about it. In fact, the Germans put it in place after World War II to cut down on the power of the German industrialists who had supported Hitler and the Nazis. And the American conquerors had to sign off on that. So we actually, in some ways, and we actually have a history of co-determination in 19-teens and 1920s in this country with our corporations too. So we actually knew about these sorts of things. And we knew that if you designed an economy a certain way with things like co-determination, it would actually make it fairer for workers. And yet we've completely lost that knowledge. And so we don't do anything like this in the US. Unfortunately, we really should look at this again, because we do have a history, our own roots in this kind of thing. But in terms of this issue, yes, I think it could potentially make a difference, because, then you don't just have, Facebook, for example, it's a privately held company, but the shareholders really don't even have any say over what the company does. Many of these Silicon Valley companies have a corporate structure in which the main founder has way more shares and way more votes when deciding issues than all the other shareholders combined and all the other boards of directors on the board combined. And so Mark Zuckerberg makes all of the decisions for Facebook. There is no board that can outvote him if he did something really egregious, as he has been doing. And so even just, there's many people who have worked within Silicon Valley who are saying even just changing the corporate structure so that it operates like a regular corporation would allow a little bit more accountability than just letting Mark Zuckerberg decide what Facebook does. But I think that, if we're going to go down that road of corporate governance, my view is that we should go more towards the utility angle and making sure that we put real rules around these platforms and what they do with our data and what they do with dark patterns and the ways they design these. It's like remember when Ralph Nader, fought the battle over seatbelts in automobiles. Originally automakers did not design them with seatbelts, and people were getting killed, and people like Ralph Nader and Nader's Raiders came along and pushed that, and Congress finally passed a law saying you have to have seatbelts. That's design, and there's many design issues like this that we should be telling these companies, you're not going to design it this way anymore. You're going to design it this way. And there are a number of people out there, technologists, who are making recommendations of better ways to design these platforms so that they're not just cued into take the data, create the psychographic profile, and get advertisers to buy those access to those profiles so that they can sell ads and we make a ton of money. That's the business model, and that's what needs to change. That's the surveillance capitalism that needs to go.
Thank you. Okay. I might have some later on that part. That was interesting. Someone asked, are any politicians taking a lead on creating a digital operating license?
In some ways, Senator Mark Warner has been very involved in this. There's a few, to the extent that they're active and they are taking a lead role, it's more been around antitrust. And now some of the NGOs that work on antitrust, like Open Markets Institute and American Economic Liberties Project, they are slowly folding into their analysis and their recommendations more information around, more recommendations around things like, in fact, I just saw they had a recommendation around no algorithmic advertising. And so slowly that's sort of making its way into, the discussion about what we should do about these platforms. But it really hasn't gotten much to the solution stage on some of these things. Europe, I saw one question there about, is Europe ahead of us? In some ways, Europe has been more ahead of us on this. A couple of years ago, they passed something called the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And that put more rules around what they can and can't do with our data. But even that, it was the first one like it in the world. So it was a good first step. But knowing what we know about these platforms, even the GDPR is really not enough. And the California Consumer Protection Act that was passed here, the new one that was just passed, those also are good steps in the right direction, but also not enough. So things are starting to happen, but and Australia just did the rule around they have to pay some of their advertising revenue to the original news creators. The state of Maryland just passed a similar law, and other states now are introducing such laws. So there's some different things happening. It's going to be hard to sort of tackle all this in one big bite, like HR1 is trying to do for our elections, right? But hopefully we'll slowly get there.
Do you envision any way we could have a law that outlaws using algorithms to push misinformation or information to us? Or that's their whole platform?
To outlaw the algorithms?
Yes.
I mean, look, we can pass a law that does anything we want. I mean, that's the real issue here that people need to understand. These companies created their machine. Their machine operates by the technologies and the software and things that they've created. But there's nothing that says we have to go along with that any longer. We can shut down their algorithms if we decide, or we can decide to tweak the algorithms, tell them how the algorithms should work. We could enter into negotiations with them over how their algorithms would work. But I mean, really, the algorithm part of it, that's the crucial part of it is, can they take our data? Once if they don't have the data, then the algorithms become much less useful, and the way the algorithms work are much less useful. So I think it really starts there with the data more than the algorithms themselves per se. The algorithms, as I said, they're geared towards engagement. We could tell them, look, we want your algorithms to be geared towards maximum public education. We want the algorithms to promote information when it comes to coronavirus pandemic that prioritizes good information. And when it comes to elections, we want you to turn off algorithms that amplify any information from those who have vested interests in the outcome. So I mean, there's different ways that they could do this kind of thing, but right now they're not doing any of this. So we have to really think about what we do with the data, and two, what we want the algorithms to do.
Okay. Richard, do you see any questions?
I have one.
Okay.
I like history, and I try to put it in some sort of context. And I'm kind of looking back 115 years ago to the Teddy Roosevelt administration, when we started, reining in or breaking up some of these monopolies. And I know in that time we had the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it seems like we're back to the Gilded Age as far as the amount of money these companies and these individuals are generating. And I'm wondering if Congress is capable of even, drafting something. It seems like a lot of Congress people don't even understand the internet yet. But we have others that could certainly do that. But how do we rein in these giant companies? What's the best agency of government, or is it a combination of, different government agencies, or even the companies themselves deciding maybe we should monitor ourselves?
Yeah, so this is how these companies have been working so far, is self-regulation, which means really nothing. And 2 years ago, I would have really shared your pessimism, but we're seeing a new wind of change, at least in the U.S. House of Representatives, among certain Democrats like David Cicilline, I think that's how you say his name, who's chair of a subcommittee that held all these hearings on antitrust and produced this amazing report. I mean, the antitrust laws haven't changed. They just haven't been used for 30, 40 years. So it's almost like a rusty machine that just doesn't work anymore. And so we're in the process of re-oiling the machine and putting on some new parts and trying to get it moving again. And the people who I talk to who are working on antitrust in the NGO community, they're very optimistic, especially now with Biden there and, a very slim majority in the Senate. But they are optimistic that there's going to be some changes coming down the line here. Because keep in mind, it's not just can you get things through the Congress, but it's also the appointments on the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, because they oversee antitrust. And and Biden just appointed a new appointee to the FTC. Her name is Lena Khan, Kahn, and she's a well-known, trust buster type of academic, a lawyer by trade. And so, this is the other, the appointees in many, not only the commissioners themselves, but then the staff within these bodies that do the research and do the recommendations that come up with innovative ways and these sorts of things. That's changing even as we speak. It takes time though. And so I think we're going to see more impact, maybe like in the summertime, and keep in mind also that right now, the Biden administration, they understand that their lifeline, which is less than 2 years, because that's when you're going to be voting for the House of Representatives again. And that's the big fear, is holding on to that House and also the Senate. So, they know that they have just a small amount of time, and they have to first nail the coronavirus, and they have to get schools back open, and they have to get the economy back open. So that's got to be the big focus. These other things are sort of happening now behind the scenes, a lot of conversations going on, some of which I'm privy to, others not. But my sense is that we're going to see more activity in the summertime as they start unveiling more of where they're coming from. But the U.S. Senate is still a big problem, and you're right. Many of the senators, they're just so old. They probably have never even used a computer. They maybe never even typed their own letters. Who knows? And so that is going to be a real challenge. But we'll see what happens.
Excellent. Thank you.
This is sort of a concern. Someone says, how could these corporations know what is true? Depends on who you believe. Just because it's in the New York Times doesn't make it true. In different countries, what is true or false is different, even in different states. So if you're going to say they can't push misinformation, then you're going to have an agency determine what is true. Or
yeah, I mean, is that what they mean by in that question about what's true? Mean about what is true about in terms of news and information kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So here's my take on it. So this is where, we're still living under this misconception that goes back 20 years of the free and open internet, and that these companies represent the new public square. And so in a public square, anybody comes in, you have like Hyde Park, free speech corner in Hyde Park. Anybody can get up on their soapbox and say whatever they want. And the content is supposed to be irrelevant and neutral. The authorities let them say what they want as long as it's not threatening or hurting anyone. But this notion is what is slowly dying. We realize more and more that these platforms are in fact publishers. They are publishers, like the New York Times is a publisher, like Fox News is a publisher or a broadcaster. And they're making editorial decisions, sometimes with algorithms, sometimes with humans, pulling the plug on Donald Trump. And so, I just don't think it's going to be sustainable, this idea that these companies are simply going to be, neutral arbiters and they're not going to be deciding what's true and what isn't true. Increasingly, I think, I say increasingly, like over the next 5 years, they're going to have to be more like the New York Times. They're going to make decisions about what kind of content they want on their platform and what kind they don't want. Because we've already seen what happens if they don't do that. And it causes meltdowns. And so how are they going to do that? Because there's just so much information passing over that platform. I think they're going to have to do something like the following. Right now, the way it works is, anybody can post anything and it can go viral, as they say. It can reach millions of people or it can reach 10 people. That's just how it works. But, you know, if you think about it, most people don't need, for the stuff they post, you know, if you're telling your family members about your latest vacation or your friends, whatever, most people don't need access to millions of people. So they've created this machine with way more capability than most people need. And so what they, instead of having the default being access to millions, if you can come up with the right content, the default could be everybody gets access to at most, say, 5,000 people. You know, and that's more access than most people will ever need. That's more access than you know, most presidents and kings and cardinals and bishops have had throughout history. So it's really not taking it away from anyone that the fact that their dance video can't go viral, you know, to millions of people, because the price for that is the meltdown of democracies. It's not just January 6th, as I remember, it's the Philippines. It's you know, in other countries where these types of things are happening. And so, but if you want to have access to that virality, like right now, the way it works is Facebook has about 30,000 monitors who are taking down content as fast as they can find it, the illegal content, the bad content, the harassing, the violent content. They're taking it down and they can't even keep up with it. They're viewing all this horrible stuff in order to do it. Some of them are getting mental health issues because Facebook has actually had to pay out for the therapy for many of these 30,000 who have to go and get therapy because they truly have to view terribly horrible stuff. So instead, you just turn all that down. Remember, one of the things I talked about at the beginning was they have unlimited reach. That's part of the problem. Don't give the default shouldn't be unlimited reach. Instead, put those 30,000 monitors to work amplifying the good content. When someone creates that dance video that's really cool, then they say, yes, this one gets permission to be able to go to be amplified and go to thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of people, who knows? So in other words, it works exactly the opposite of the way it ought to work. They've created this machine with no liability, with no accountability, and the machine, the design of the machine itself is what is at fault. Instead of having, as I said at the beginning, unlimited reach, non-human curation, and near zero friction, you instead change that so that you have limited reach, limited scale, you have a lot more friction, and you use humans to amplify the content that is cool and good. And there's enough good content on there that those 30,000 will be kept busy. I think that is the direction that this kind of thing is going to have to go. I can't see how the current business model, the current design of this machine is ever going to produce more other than what we've already seen.
That sounds reasonable. I think I read an article and it was from the perspective of someone from Facebook, and they were trying to project what we can do in the future. And their idea was to limit the number of people that you could have in your group. And but then what if you have already found a QAnon person as a friend? That QAnon person could still pump misinformation to you. So, but at least it would be limited. It wouldn't go viral.
It wouldn't be as fast. It would be introducing friction to the machine so that it's not like lightning happening, boom, 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 boom. So that's the other part is creating more friction in this machine. And you know, and I think if we do this, we'll still find that these platforms and the technologies can be amazing. We'll still have access to all the information we could possibly want, but the crazy town stuff is going to not get as far. It's not going to go as viral. And as I said, you'll still have the ability for, you know, your neighbor's kid creates this amazing dance video that can still go viral, but they'll have a process where they'll say, hey, I'd like you to look at my dance video and approve of it to go further, to be able to have possible virality. And yes, that means these platforms are going to be making decisions about what is amplified and what isn't. But you know what? That's what a publisher does. That's what a New York Times does every single day. The New York Times they can decide, we don't want Donald Trump having access to us. He can go on Fox News, and Fox News doesn't give Joe Biden access to its platform. So, I mean, this is just how publishing has always worked. We've somehow gotten diluted by this dream that we had starting in the 1990s of the free and open internet. and that this was going to be a game changer, and this was going to get rid of the authorities and the ones who are the bottlenecks, the chokeholds on information. Well, that was a beautiful dream. And I think we can still have a version of it, but it can't be the pure one that many people wanted, because look what's happening.
Thank you. Could holding shareholders could the shareholders make them accountable or have any impact?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, on these platform companies, the CEOs basically
Right.
have way more voting power than the shareholders or even the boards of directors. So yes, if there was a way to force Mark Zuckerberg to have to give up some of his voting power so that the board of directors actually had some power over Mark Zuckerberg, then, maybe we could see some impacts. I don't think it would have that big of an impact, because the board of directors, their duty is still to try and maximize shareholder value. I mean, there is some discussion about what they call.
But if you're not talking about the shareholders as the board of directors, if you're talking about all of those shareholders as being the people who have Facebook stock in their portfolio of their retirement plans, or their all those 401k investments, that's what I'm talking about. If they felt like there was some accountability that they could be liable for something that happened in January 6th because their investment they are part of, riled people up, gave false information, became the conduit for how to get there and make it wild, and people died. And
right. I mean, but there's no think about it when was it Ford Motor Company that had that ignition switch issue? The shareholders are not legally responsible for when a corporation makes a bad product like that. What happens to them is, if the company's stock plummets, they lose money. Right. So that's the liability there. That's the accountability. But it's a pretty limited thing. I don't see that would prompt Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook or any of these companies to redesign their business model, because shareholders they want the company. They have a vested interest in that company's stock being as high as possible. And look, I mean, Facebook, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, some of you might remember that, where all this data was taken, Facebook had to pay a $5 billion fine levied by the Federal Trade Commission. This was the largest fine in the history of the FTC, in the history of the United States. $5 billion. And Facebook made that back within 2 months of their stock climbing.
Absolutely, because they don't see themselves as a communications company. They see themselves as a data company, and what their business is data mining.
It's advertising. That's what their business is, selling ads.
It's data mining.
The data is a way to sell the ads.
It's a way to sell a lot of things.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm saying 98% of Facebook's revenue, that $86 billion, it comes from advertising revenue. It doesn't come from just mining data or selling that data. In fact, Facebook, they say anyway, that they do not sell data. They sell access to the psychographic profiles that they've created about all of us, and for advertisers to have access to that, so they can hyper target ads. I mean, some of you might be familiar with the term long tail marketing, which is what these companies are doing. I mean, it used to be, if you're an advertiser, you're trying to advertise to the sort of the broad spectrum of consumers out there, right? And so you want information on what the broadest sector of consumer is that you can advertise to, and then you target your ads to that. But there's all sorts of other consumers out there that don't fit into that broadest category, broad sector. Instead, they're all sorts of micro niches of consumers out there. But advertisers never had a way to go after those consumers with the old technologies. Well, so with Facebook and these other platforms, you can do this micro niche targeting to all of the different other micro niches of consumers out there. And actually, when you add up all those micro niches together, it's actually bigger than the broad sector of consumers. And so this is
when I buy advertising as part of my job. Okay. I buy for 75 people in San Francisco. I don't buy for all of San Francisco. I buy for the 75 people who fit my particular demographic. And yeah, absolutely. That's how it works.
That's how it works. And that's how the political ads work now too. I mean, Donald Trump's campaign supposedly, allegedly had like 10,000 versions of the same ad, just tweaked a little bit to target another small group of swing voters, you know? And so this is the ecosystem that they've created with these technologies. And I don't see that that the shareholders really understand it even that much, let alone are going to have an opinion on it. It's more the boards of directors that know more about this. I mean, people, you might be familiar with a person by the name of Roger McNamee. He wrote a book called Zucked. And he was an original investor in Facebook and was a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg. And he's now out there saying, like, we had no idea what we were creating. This is a nightmare. This is a Frankenstein monster that is now running across the landscape, and we have to shut it down. And so, more and more people are realizing this, but when you're original investor, your shareholder, you don't really get yourself involved in that kind of stuff.
I think the article I read also said how Facebook, well, we won't use your data, for advertisers to target you. We were sort of we'll group the data together so they're not advertising to you, but they're still using your data, right?
So the other type of data that, you have hyper-targeted data. What we used to have, like with newspapers, it's what's called contextual advertising. So, you're reading the New York Times, they kind of have a somewhat of an idea of who the demographics are that read the New York Times. And then in certain sections of the paper, like the business section or the sports section or the fashion section, they have another slice of what kind of people are going to read those sections. And so the ads are broadly tuned to the readers who they think are going to be looking at those sections in the newspaper, right?
But
That's called contextual advertising.
To do that, they still have to use my data in order to develop that. So the idea is, how do we prevent them from using our data? What can we do?
I mean, this use of data has been going on for decades, but it's now being on steroids. And so this hyper-targeted data use and advertising is really, it's like, I like chocolate cake, but if I eat the whole cake, it's a bad thing. If I eat one piece, it's a good thing, right? So it's gone too far. And so it's not so much that there can't be advertising or can't be even targeted advertising. Contextual advertising would be okay. It's this hyper-targeted that's using our psychographic profiles from the data that they have taken for every like and share and everything that we've done. We could simply say, you can't take data from the likes and shares anymore. You can't accumulate that data. You can maybe have on the webpage, you can see on Facebook how many people liked your post. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they're taking that data from each individual who liked it and they're compiling it. So we can say you can still accumulate likes on a particular post, but you can't accumulate that data anymore. You see the difference? And so that's the kind of discernment that we have to start thinking about in order to retain the good things of these platforms and get rid of the bad.
Thank you. Richard, do you see any other questions?
Yeah, I think, Karen Beck had a question. Do we need a new government agency to regulate, or I guess have it part of an existing agency, or like the Department of Commerce or something?
I definitely think we need a new government agency. I don't think it has to be a cabinet level position or something. It could be housed under an existing one like the Federal Trade Commission, perhaps, though the Federal Trade Commission has been so moribund for so many years that I'm reluctant to house anything under that until I see more signs of life there. But with Lena Khan being appointed and other people, I think we will see that. So anyway, I think that, there needs to be, California just created an agency. It's not going to have a whole lot of power, but it's at least going to be able to track these companies and try to get a better sense of what they're doing and these sorts of things. I think we need more of this. And I think at the federal level, it makes sense. They're trying to do some things like this at the EU level too. I think that this is, it's time to do this kind of thing. We periodically do this when a new technology arises or some new thing happens. Like I said, the SEC, when the stock market crashed in 1929, the Department of Energy in the 1970s, when we had nuclear power and the existing agencies couldn't deal with these sorts of things. So we created a new energy, in that case, a cabinet level position.
What's the name of the California agency?
I can't remember off the top of my head. It was part of we just passed the law in November of 2020. Um, there's this one guy in California, Alistair McTaggart. He's a real estate guy, and is just so fed up with Facebook that he's putting his own money behind it. And he was behind the money behind the California Consumer Protection Act, which is basically like what the Europeans did, the General Data Protection Regulation, but a specific one for California. And he also then put his money up and did this other one that passed that's going to put even more rules around it. And it created an agency that I can't remember the, I mean, actually somewhere on my messy desk, I do have a piece of paper on it, but I'm not sure I can find it right at the moment. Let's see. If I find it, I'll let you know. Oh, maybe this is it. Let's see. Do I have the name of it? Yes, it's called the California Privacy Protection Agency.
Yeah.
It hasn't been set up yet because the law just went into place. I think it's going to take them a couple of years to set it up.
There's some more.
And I should say that law, it will have, they're going to have to obtain permission before collecting data from consumers who are younger than 16. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out because, as I said, these platforms say, oh, we can't tell how old they are. And so they're going to, you know, whether there'll have to be some enforcement issue there saying like, sorry, you must figure out how old they are.
Question from Jillian Elliott. Technology could wipe out bots in an hour just by making each person confirm they are not a robot with each post. Not sure how effective that would be.
Well, I think it's an interesting question because what it means is like, let's say, for example, you know, again, we talked about the idea of friction, introducing more friction into this. So let's say you're on Facebook and now you can leave a comment to your friend's comment. What if, you know, you typed your comment and then you had to hit send or whatever I forget what you hit on Facebook, and you had to type in a passcode real quick. Would that be a huge imposition? But doing that, you know, might crack down on some of this, you know, artificial intelligence driven bots and things. I mean, in other words, there are ways to design in more friction that, yes, it would be a little bit more of an inconvenience for you, but it would crack down on these types of activities that are causing so many problems. I mean, I think the trade-off is worth it in my view.
Sheila Fish says liability is the key. Make them responsible as newspapers are, and let the libel laws do their work.
And that's what, if we get rid of Section 230, or they're talking about modifying it to do just that. And I think that's either one of those would be fine with me. But again, keep in mind that most of the disinformation, like all the stuff that Trump was putting out about a stolen election, right? There's no liability issue there in a legal sense. So right. It wouldn't crack down on any of that. And that stuff is the bigger problem in terms of meltdown of our democracy. So that's the dilemma there is, you know, we have to figure out another way that's going to deal with just the fire hose of disinformation that's being pumped out by, you know, Republicans, far right, and others.
Yeah. Ellis, Sharon and Ellis or Goldberg were asking, would holding executives criminally responsible make a difference? Do damage, go to jail?
Yeah, I think you know, there's a number of you know, law enforcement interventions there, including even bigger fines than $5 billion. But I think, you know, depending on how egregious, having the executives being criminally responsible is viable, is credible to do that. I mean, you know, remember the Volkswagen fuel injection scandal where they programmed their software on their computers in the cars so that when you went for your emissions test, it detected that this car is about to have an emissions test, and it changed your emissions to pass the test. But that wasn't the emissions that you were doing on a normal basis when you're driving your car around. This was completely illegal. Well, there are executives from Volkswagen that are sitting in jail in Germany right now for that. And, you know, yeah, I mean, but again, Facebook isn't breaking any laws right now because we don't have any laws. They made up these rules themselves, and we haven't put any laws around these guys, except for, I mean, Section 230 gives them blank check immunity, even from illegal content.
This club passed a resolution relative to that, which said that corporate executives who do harm by putting profit before health, safety, privacy, or the environment shall be subject to criminal penalties. And that wouldn't just apply to the internet, but would apply to people marketing vaping to our kids, would involve the people behind the opioid epidemic, would apply to a lot of different areas. But the privacy part applies to the companies that you're talking about. And in case anybody here, I heard somebody at the beginning of this, we had a chat, somebody said that they love Facebook or Instagram was the best. I have to remind the Democrats on this call that Facebook was behind Donald Trump being elected. And if you think that that wasn't doing us any harm or doing this planet any harm, you don't live on the same planet that I do.
Well, you know, I mean, I think that, you know, you have to realize that Facebook has about 5 different businesses now. And they actually have an Amazon type marketplace on there. They're a publisher, as I've said now, there's no question about that. They are, to some degree, a public square, and they're a networking tool for, you know, for keeping in touch with friends and family and what have you. So, I mean, I think we have to, you know, I think the part where you're keeping in touch with friends and family is still pretty cool. You can do it. It's pretty easy to do. And I think for a lot of people, that's what they think of when they think of Facebook. And so we have to think about the 5 different parts to Facebook and figure out rules around each one of them that will make them all okay, working better. So I mean, I wouldn't be too harsh on anyone who says like, I like Facebook, because they may be thinking like, I can keep in touch with my brother in North Carolina, my sister in Florida, through Facebook. And that's pretty cool. You know, I can share my photos of them. I can see their baby photos. I can see videos from them. You know, people have used it for a lot of amazing things. It's a pretty amazing technology. It's the problem is that that's what it started out as, and everyone got the sense of how cool it was, and then it grew into these other things. And those other things are what's creating a lot of the problems, in my view.
Are there any other questions? I mean, Ellis, you brought up the idea that, yeah, they did push a lot of information that Trump said, and if they push the information that the election was a fraud, but they've taken Trump down because of that, haven't they?
Too little, too late.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I was really referring to Cambridge Analytica, which farmed Facebook to get allegedly 4,000 data points for the profile you were talking about, and then gave those profiles to the Russians. There's a documentary about that where the chief information officer, I believe, of Cambridge Analytica admitted going to Russia and giving them that information.
Mm-hmm.
Facebook sold out this country. Nothing less. Treason.
I don't think so.
My wife doesn't think so.
Well, this has been fascinating, Stephen Hill. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions, even from the floor? Any? I think I've learned a lot, and we want to thank you for being here and our speaking.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
And maybe you could, do you have any idea of what kind of government official, who's a legislator who might be interested in this? Do you have any ideas?
No, but you know, I mean, I have ideas, but they're not really yet at that point. They're still holding hearings, as we saw again today. I mean, how many of these hearings have we have to have where Zuckerberg and Jack, I forget the Twitter guy's last name. You know, they get up there and basically don't answer questions. I mean, it's just frustrating as heck. And so but I think we're going to see more coming in the next, say, 6 months. And as I hear things, Brody, I can certainly pass them on to you, and you can pass them on to others. We'll see. There's a lot of bills that are being proposed. None of them are really moving yet, partly because, as I said, their priorities are clear about coronavirus and opening the economy, opening schools. They know they got to do that. And you got to get all these vaccinations into people's arms. And that's the priority now. But that doesn't mean there aren't conversations happening right now and bills being introduced and discussions happening in the halls of DC. And I think at some point those will emerge, and some of these other things, these other priorities will be behind us, and they'll be focusing more on this. I mean, Joe Biden has said, he thinks we should revoke Section 230. So,
Yeah.
How
I
can we
think,
follow your work? Or do you have a blog?
yes, you can. I have a website, Steven Steven-Hill.com.
Thank you.
And you can see a number of articles that I've written recently in different media outlets about a lot of the same issues we've been talking about, and also what's going on in Europe. If you're interested in what the EU is doing, I write a lot about that too.
Great.
So that's Steven-Hill.com.
Yeah, it's a hyphen. So, there's two different. Yeah, there's if you do a dash, I don't know if it'll read that. It's a hyphen.
Yeah, the dash doesn't work.
Oh, it's not an underscore.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I have a question that's not related to the topic, but you said you were near the beach. Which beach?
Ocean Beach in San Francisco.
Oh, Ocean Beach. That's great.
I'm in the outer Sunset.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's nice when the sun's out.
Yeah.
We get a lot of fog though.
mm.
Yeah.
He's near
Stephen,
Carroll.
Well, Stephen, I hope you will keep in touch with us.
Absolutely.
Email me when you know information, and I will pass it on to our members.
Okay, sounds great.
And thank you, everyone, for being here.
You all have a great
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me get my thumb, my golden thumb. There it is. Thanks.
Ready?
Yeah.
Well, that was fun.
Very interesting.